hello everybody, and thank you for coming to this session. Welcome. So, I'm going to share two projects that I've been involved in I wanted to continue a programme. Is that better? Oh, thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Okay, so I'll just turn it this way a little bit, otherwise I'm on an angle. Is that all right? Yeah? Okay, cool. If you can't hear me, let me know. So one is a grounded, hands-on experiment, my favourite kind of work. And the other is a strategic intervention with an unconventional approach. So I just want to gauge your temperature in the room. Who is an artist who creates work? Put your hand up. If you create work, really high so I can see. So we've got 3, 4. Who tours work? Yeah? Okay, great. Lovely. Cool. So both of these projects then I hope you'll find interesting. And they're designed to give you food for thought. So, programme number 1. In 2016, myself and an associate were commissioned to produce a review of touring dance and drama in Scotland because it wasn't working, basically, and they wanted to figure out what was going wrong at a systemic level. And so what I want to do is to pick out some of the highlights of the review that deals specifically with rural touring. There's lots of other information in the review. You can access it on the Creative Scotland website. There's lots of quantitative data, lots of qualitative data. But basically, I want to tell you the story of what went wrong with rural touring. So, first of all, there was a problem between supply and demand. Creative Scotland wanted to support as much touring as cost-effectively as possible. And what this meant was there was a disproportionate amount of funding going to new work that was low cost and small scale. And this wasn't the work that the majority of rural audiences understood or perhaps even wanted. Why? Well, because much of the work was being created by urban artists based in Edinburgh and Glasgow, which is where most of these artists live. And the work that they were creating was primarily suited for urban audiences in urban contexts. And for many of these artists, rural touring was perceived as the poor relation, something that they had to do in order to get funds for touring more generally. Much of the product, the work, was artistically driven, which is not a bad thing. But because these artists had a limited understanding of rural contexts and rural audiences, the work didn't land well, and too often those audiences didn't have a good experience. As a result, the promoters found it difficult to find the right work for their audiences, and for the audiences to find the right kind of work for themselves. Another important factor was the prevalence of hit-and-run touring, where because of the economies of scale, they only go in for one night. Boom! Blink and you've missed them, yeah? So there was no opportunity to build audiences within a visit to a community. And it became clear that rural audiences were not well served by the current setup, and something had to be done. So I teamed up with Joe McLean, CEO of the Touring Network, a rural touring development agency for the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Dream job, by the way. And we developed an idea that eventually became Brawl, a 2-year experiment looking at alternative ways of creating vibrant new work for rural audiences. We worked with 3 urban-based artists with little or no experience of rural touring, whose devising processes were largely artistically driven and studio-based. Matt Lenton is Artistic Director of Vanishing Point Theatre Company. Safi Seoti is an independent dancer and choreographer. And if there's any dancers or choreographers here, some of you might know her because she's been building a relationship over a couple of years now with Dance Festival Barents and Dance Arena Nord in Hammerfest. And then there's Heather Marshall, a disability-identified theatre practitioner. We partnered each of them with a rural promoter, and because Safi and Heather were independent, they were also partnered with producers who could support them with the experiments. We also created the post of animateur to be the bridge builder between the artists, promoters and audiences, and that became our lovely Kate. There were 4 key concepts that we wanted to test with Brawl. They are slow touring, design thinking, artistic vibrancy, and audience engagement. So I'm going to go through each of those, okay? So slow touring. Because this was a 2-year experiment, we weren't in a rush. We had plenty of time to test out alternative approaches, so we slowed the whole thing down and we stretched it out. And like in slow motion or freeze frame, you can have a look at where the problems are and iron out the kinks, 1 frame at a time. This allowed us to build in time for reflection and discussion and find ways to solve the inherent problems. What we weren't saying was that it would take 2 years to develop new work for rural touring. We were simply using that timescale to investigate the problem and exploring what could be done differently. The next element that we introduced was design thinking. This is a creative 5-stage process that supports the development of new, largely commercial products and services. At its heart is an ethos called human-centered design. We wanted to explore how human-centered design might support the creation of new artistic work that is better able to connect with audiences. So we adapted the process for artistic production, and in a way that didn't compromise the integrity of the artist. The first stage is empathy. We wanted the artists and promoters to build stronger working relationships with each other by deepening their appreciation of each other's contexts, processes, and challenges. Something that was woefully lacking in the current touring system, where the relationships were shallow and largely transactional. So we ran a 3-day residential that centred on empathy building, which was followed by site visits hosted by the promoters, where artists could immerse themselves in ruralness and rural communities. In the define stage, artists would seek inspiration from their initial visits to their community and use this as a basis for creating a brand new piece of work. This didn't have to be about the place or community, it just needed to be inspired by it. Our hypothesis was that this might lead to work better able to resonate with rural communities. Ideate became the artist devising process, but with a difference. Artists would share their ideas and processes with promoters at a very early stage. In this way, the promoters gained a more direct understanding of the work, so they could better communicate it to their communities. And the artists would benefit from the promoters' input into how audiences might respond, or their advice around more practical considerations such as performance contexts. So in this way, artist and promoter fed each other. Finally, with prototyping and testing, we invited the artists to conduct 2 sharings of their work in progress with members of the community for feedback. This would give the artists a chance to see how their work landed at an early stage in development. It provided the promoters with new opportunities to engage with their communities in new and different ways, and perhaps engage with new people they hadn't previously come into contact with. And it gave audiences an opportunity to meet the artists and become curious or intrigued or feel invested in the work. The third concept we wanted to test is one that I've been working on for a number of years now, which is artistic vibrancy. This is the dimensions of the audience experience and the value audience place on it relative to artistic intent. Why did we want to explore this? Well, to move the touring dialogue on from the quality of the work to include its value for audiences. You see, whilst artistic quality is usually decided by experts, the human value of art can only be determined by the audience. I call this human value vibrancy. This is what the work brings to the audience, their experience of it, and what it means for them. Feelings and emotions, altered perspectives, a sense of place, belonging, identity, degrees of relevance and meaning, etc., etc. Artistic vibrancy is about the artistic intentionality of the work and whether the artist has achieved their goals in terms of how they want their work to impact on audiences. For me, the focus on artistic vibrancy is a much needed antidote to a singular focus on quality or excellence. You can have a high quality process, but the work bombs with audiences. You can have highly entertaining work that has no quality at all. And you can have work that has specific artistic intention for the audience that is of high quality and which vibrantly lands with the audience in a way that supports that artistic intention. That is artistic vibrancy. And because Brawl was about how to create appealing, relevant and meaningful new work for rural audiences, exploring the artistic vibrancy of that work was key to determining how successful we were. So this ethos was baked into the programme. So we sought to develop the artist's audience sensibility in rural contexts through the site visits and the testing events. We invited them to express their artistic intention from the audience perspective, and we asked them to reflect on how their artistic decisions would contribute to this. Then, after the show, I conducted qualitative research to explore the dimensions of the audience experience to ascertain whether the performances had resulted in a vibrant experience from the audience perspective, as well as the degree to which these experiences met the artist's intention. Also, there were experiences that the artist never intended that were amazing, and that was the gift. So I'll share later how this panned out. So the fourth thing we introduced was meaningful engagement. The last element we brought into the mix was this new role, the animateur, someone who could creatively bridge the work and the audience through bespoke engagement activity. The aim was to arouse curiosity, involve people in the themes of the work, create a community of interest around it, increase their preparedness for the work if they decided they wanted to go and experience it, and in doing so, seek to elicit the deepest, richest, most meaningful experiences of that work as possible. We also wanted the engagement to be light and nimble and repeatable, something that wouldn't put a lot of strain on the promoters. This wasn't just an audience development initiative. It was about creating alternative ways of engaging with the work in a way that would deliver genuine value for everybody who engaged in it. So those are the four things that we introduced into the model. So I just want to spell out now what Brawl was not. So it was not participatory art, it was not socially engaged practice, and it was not community theatre. What it was the artistically driven development of new work for rural audiences, working with devising artists from urban centres to dismantle the barriers between them, the promoter and the audience, in order to deepen audience sensibility, experiment with informed risk-taking, create artistically vibrant work supported by bespoke audience engagement to add value. Okay? So it was a rich, complex, joyous, frustrating, sometimes disastrous 2 years. We had some great successes and we had some brilliant failures. And unfortunately, there isn't time to go into this in any detail. We could write a book about what happened. It was like a huge social experiment. So I'm going to share some of the highlights, and if anybody's interested, you can always quiz me afterwards or by Skype if you want to go any deeper into any of these elements. So first off, the residential was extremely successful in developing artists' understanding of what it's like to be a rural promoter. They saw how vulnerable these promoters can feel, how a bad show could damage their reputational standing in a small community and make them feel like they'd let everybody down. And they realised that there was a lot more at stake for the promoters than just selling tickets. They also came to understand better the logistical constraints of performing in a non-theatre venue, the importance of the social experience for audiences who live in dispersed communities, and the fact that their visit might be only one of 3 or 4 touring shows that year, so it really matters. And all this influenced the artist's thinking and practice during the experiments. One of the companies went to the Isle of Egg. It's a small island, community-owned, with 130 people on there. It's a beautiful, otherworldly, amazing place. And the artists descended on the island, and it was a disaster. The artists and the promoters hadn't really thought through how to introduce the artists into such a small community. It felt a bit like a circus coming to town. Lucy, the promoter, arranged a get-to-know-you campfire on the beach, but the islanders and the artists sat apart. The locals viewed the artists with suspicion. The artists didn't know what to say to the locals, and the promoter felt even more vulnerable. Ouch. Let's move on. For Heather, well, Heather's experience could have potentially been disastrous, but actually it was an epiphany for her. She went to the village of Loch Goilhead, which is an end of Loch community, and it was an extreme experience because she'd never been outside of the cities before. She expected it to be a beautiful rural experience, but actually she realised how different rural life is out in the urban. From the urban, as you can see, there was nothing to do. There was no shops. She got bored, and it came as a bit of a shock. But she threw herself into it and talked to as many locals as she could in the pub, the bowling club, the social events, etc. And they loved her. And she came away with a lot of stories. And when she thought she was going to write a beautiful piece about how amazing it is to live in the countryside, she actually wrote a dark piece around rural isolation, otherness, and mental health, which the audience really got. But that was good. Testing the work. So, Isle of Egg, the tea rooms in the Isle of Egg. There's Matt. Matt is not a performer. He's an artistic director of the highest order, if you know what I mean. Testing the work was a hugely formative experience for all of them, especially Matt. Here he is, testing out the initial draft of the Dark Carnival Unplugged, an anarchic musical theatre piece about death and the afterlife. The venue, the tea rooms. The place, packed with adults, children and dogs. And they were really close to him, like, ugh. And everyone had heard about the artist and they were all intrigued to see what was on offer. And Matt was petrified. But good on him. He stood up and he did his bit. And as someone who is fearlessly artistically driven and who wasn't used to working in this way, the experience shifted his perspective. His experience of sharing the work in development in this relaxed, highly social, informal setting where everybody knows everybody else informed the following creative decisions. The atmosphere of the show would be relaxed and social with a glass of whiskey given free to all the adults. Woo! It was a whiskey company sponsored the tour because of that very decision. The work would be told by a performative storytelling rather than the fourth wall, so the audience would feel part of the story as members of the afterlife, the community of the dead, because they really understand what it's like to feel part of a community. The actors would engage directly with the audiences, see them, talk to them, sing with them, dance with them, all together in a communal shared experience. It would be familiar but different. It would be social and art, but it would be more a gathering than a performance. And as we'd hoped, the testing event inspired and engaged everybody there and generated interest in what the final piece would be like. Whilst the work was being devised, lovely Kate's job, we always call her lovely Kate because she's just so lovely, was to create additional touch points that would engage the people of Egg, to generate this sense of expectation, to connect them with the themes of the work, and in a way that created value in their own right. So her and the promoter got together and created Death Island Discs, where the community was invited to submit pieces of music they would take with them to the afterlife, with an explanation of why they chose that piece of music. These were uploaded onto the Death Island Discs website by Kate, the ghost DJ, and she would comment on the choices made by people to create this sense of interaction. This created a buzz across this island. Songs were submitted. People were talking about it in the tea room and in the fields. And there was interest in the show. On the night of the performance, people entered the hall to the sound of the playlist. You could see the audience recognizing their own tunes, trying to guess who had chosen the others and the reasons why. This fueled much conversation and laughter as people swapped stories about the songs they chose. This added a whole new dimension to the evening and created the perfect opener to an irreverent musical theatre piece about the afterlife. And after the performance, the playlist was given to the island as a gift, a little legacy of a beautiful project. The show itself was a huge success, a two-hander, except of course the whole of the audience were the community of the dead. The research I conducted revealed that the audience experience perfectly aligned with Matt's intentions. They felt a strong sense of captivation and involvement in the performance. They enjoyed feeling part of a shared space with the actors implicated in the story as the undead. They felt connected to the performers through direct address, and the informal setting made the whole evening feel like a community gathering as well as a theatre performance. all of which resulted in deeper emotional engagement with the characters, the themes, and the story. The atmosphere was electric, and the show was artistically vibrant. So I want to share a second one with you, which is from Safi. So Safi is a process-driven choreographic artist who creates work that is non-linear and abstract, and the kind of work the majority of audiences would call risky. When Safi visited Forres in the northeast of Scotland, she was struck by the fact that water was everywhere, in river, sea, and stream. And she decided to create a choreographed experience that made connections between that and the human body in a piece called Bodies of Water. At the start of the broad experiment, Safi was not enthusiastic about the concept of audience-centric practice because she thought it would interfere with her artistic process. But as she and her team began engaging with the community through the testing events, she became increasingly audience-centric, focusing in on the impact of the piece on the people present. Each testing event helped her to tune into the audience experience and refine her work to create something subtle, atmospheric, slow, delicate, and deep. Kate designed two artistic activities, or two engagement activities. First, she worked with a local walkers club, and they were invited to design a walk with all the places that had water, so with all the places that meant a lot to them, that were surrounded by water. So the walkers curated a walk, and then they took the artists on their walk, and then the walkers shared their experiences and their sort of memories of these areas with the artists, so that fed the artists. And the artists started sharing their thoughts about their work and some readings, and that fed the walkers. And the subsequent walk is an enduring legacy of that experience for the local walking group. Then in the week before the show, poetry was displayed around the town to encourage people to notice the water around them. That's all. And then there's a little bit of writing at the bottom that tells you that something might be going on. It wasn't advertising, it was installation. And it was very beautiful, done in the same subtle reflective tone as the piece itself. And the piece was very unusual. It began with audiences making a small clay pot to hold water before sitting in a circle within which the performance unfolded. Time slowed down, the senses sharpened, and we entered a watery world. There were shells and pebbles and sand and seaweed and feathers from the very landscape of this community. A haunting watery soundscape of found sound from the area sharpened your ears, and ice dripped and splashed. There was dance with spoken word, playful water pouring. Audiences got their hands wet and took part in water rituals. And Safi's moving body became a living metaphor of the water within us and the water without. The audience research revealed the degree to which the piece impacted on audiences at a very deep level. They talked about the experience being pleasingly multisensory, evocative, immersive, peaceful, subtle, calming, and it made them reflect on and experience water in new and different ways. For some, it was transformative. Safi had succeeded in her intention to combine multisensory stimulation and choreography to create a series of meditations on the theme of water that would deeply engage audiences. It was artistically vibrant. So what did we learn? Well, slow is good, but not too slow. We lost a lot of momentum over the 2 years, and it was hard to keep the energy going. This was okay because we knew we weren't developing a 2-year model, but with the benefit of hindsight, I think we would have logged 6 months off it and just tightened everything up. So if you want to do a long exploratory thing, just think about the touch points and milestones you put in place to make sure that you maintain momentum and you get a chance to check in with everybody along the way. Our investment in supporting deeper understanding around artistic process, promoter challenges and rural communities really paid off. Artists and promoters were able to make better decisions, work together more productively and develop trust, which was really important as the whole project was about taking artistic risk. To begin with, and then the third thing is design thinking is a useful model. As I said earlier, artists were not enthusiastic about using this model, but by engaging in the process, it focused their minds and it shifted their perspective. They came to appreciate how it could inform creative development and risk-taking. Whereas before, they worried that an audience-centric approach would dumb down their work, they realised that the opposite was the case. And finally, creative engagement within a slower touring model can add real value. And as you saw from the two little examples I gave you, lightness of touch is key. We didn't run a workshop about death. Do you know what I mean? It's like, that's just like too much. So it was really trying to find the tone. It was not about being heavy-handed. It was about making sure that each thing was an experience in its own right, that it created thematic connections with the work, it aroused curiosity and set the tone for the piece. So it set appropriate expectations. So what next? Well, we've just finished it, and Joe and I are still in thinking mode. We're not quite sure how we're going to do this and where we're going to find the money for it, but I'm going to run it past you and you can tell me what you think if we have time. So we're thinking of setting up a little rural touring academy, which might scale, but we'll start it small if we get the money. And the aim of the academy is to build better and more productive relationships between the artists, promoters and audiences in rural touring, because there's just, you know, it's just a disaster. People aren't understanding each other's perspectives. Better equipped promoters to host artists, market the work and creatively engage their communities, and work with artists to further develop and share the processes we've tested in the broad project, excuse me, and embed a mindset around audience-centric practice and informed risk-taking. So wish me luck. I really want to get this off the ground. So we've got just a couple of minutes before I go on to my second story. Does anybody have any questions about this project in particular whilst it's fresh in your minds? No? Okay. Oh, yes?
When you go to this local community, how far in advance did you contact these people or book this week? Or?
Okay, yeah. So what we did was we put call-outs, so people had to apply to be part of the programme, and so we partnered up the successful promoters with the successful artists in a random way, so we weren't kind of social engineering the whole thing. And basically, it was up to the promoter and the artist to decide how they would be introduced. And there was a lot of conversation about the concept of privilege. So in a lot of these communities, there's not a lot of privilege for a lot of people who work there. They work hard, they juggle multi-jobs, it's harsh living conditions. So they decided, all these artists, oh, we're being paid to, no, tell me all about you, and I'm going to make some art, and, you know, so it was about not alienating them in any way. Obviously, Matt and his team went about it completely the wrong way, and that really backfired, so we had to do a rescue of that one. But in the other two places, it was incredibly subtle. In fact, the audiences, the communities hardly knew that the artists were there unless they came across them. So that's what I mean. It wasn't about inhaling and doing that. It was more about osmosis. Do you know what I mean? It's a very different kind of way of being in a place. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Cool. So I'll move on to the next little bit, which is shorter. So you remember me talking about the touring review that I did for Creative Scotland? Well, both Creative Scotland and myself were struck by how audiences had become lost in the process and the consciousness of touring. All that mattered was that there was an audience development plan to get them in. And we started to think, we did a systems review to figure out how this happened. And it was because the hoops the artists had to jump through to get the funding reflected the funder priorities. And none of those funder priorities centred on the potential value of the work from the audience perspective. So Creative Scotland changed one of the hoops. You see, the touring fund application system was all about the work and audience development. It wasn't about the audience. So up until recently, artists needed to provide an audience development plan as part of their funding application to prove they were trying to encourage audiences to come to their work. Now this is inherently problematic because all the audience development plans look the same I've 20 years I've been reading audience development plans. They're all virtually the same, with the same target groups and the same ways of reaching them. And in essence, most of these audience development plans are deeply patronising, operating from the belief that audiences should come to see their work because it's good for them. And unsurprisingly, very few of these audience development plans worked because too many of the audiences that came were disappointed. So now, instead of producing an audience development plan, that's been taken out of the funding application process. You don't have to put in Scotland an audience development plan up, but you are now required to write a statement of audience benefits. This is the new hoop, okay? One that focuses on why the work should be funded in the first place, the benefit they think audiences will derive from the work. Everything I mentioned earlier, thoughts, feelings, emotions, all that lovely goodness, the stuff that matters so much. And the thinking behind this is that an audience benefit statement would act like a key to unlock very stuck ways of working by enabling the key players in the touring system to make better decisions. You see, within the touring ecology, there are 3 different types of decisions that need to be made. The funder is responsible for supporting a diverse portfolio of touring work for national public benefit. The venue or programmer is responsible for programming diverse work for local benefit. And the audience member chooses to attend a performance for their own personal benefit. So the thinking was that by having an audience benefit statement, we would set off a chain reaction that would demolish all the barriers to a healthy touring ecosystem by helping people at every stage make more informed decisions. A little bit like this. The Touring Fund panel would more insightfully fund a diverse range of touring work for diverse audiences. Promoters would be better equipped to assess how relevant or appealing their work might be for their audiences in their towns and their communities. Marketing and communications would become more audience-friendly, relevant and persuasive. Audiences would be able to make more informed booking decisions. Who doesn't want them to do that? And more audiences would be persuaded to attend new work and perhaps try something new and different, whatever that means for them. And artists found this hard. They weren't used to thinking in this way. They were being asked to articulate something that for many was intuitive. And importantly, they didn't have the language to write the audience benefit statement because they'd been conditioned to write the jargon of funding applications. So Creative Scotland asked me to develop a methodology that would guide them into writing this element of the form and workshop it with artists considering applying to the Touring Fund. So I created a framework called the Artistic Intentionality Framework. And again, all my frameworks are really simple, but they go really deep. So this framework is the artist's intention for the audience. It's not prescribing it. It's not saying they're absolutely going to have it. It's totally acknowledging the right of the audience to have their own experience. But without intentionality, without understanding what their value is to the audience, why the heck should they be funded to tour that work to audiences? Yeah? Just because it's got quality? I personally don't think that's the right way to go around things, and neither does Creative Scotland. So the process begins by reflecting on your artistic purpose, to look at the artistic goals of their practice in general, to really reconnect with the reason why they're doing what they're doing. Next, they look at the work that they want to create or have created and want to tour. What's the inspiration for it? What are the themes, ideas and concepts behind it? And how would the artist describe it? Then we move our attention to the audience. What kind of people were the artists hoping to reach and engage? And not tick boxes, like, nice fleshed out types of people. And how would the audience, and what might motivate the audience to come to that piece of work? Then we looked at the audience experience. What would the artist ideally like to evoke in the audience? And in what ways might this experience matter to the audience? The next stage was to then explore how specific artistic choices might result in that intended audience experience. That's the craft, yeah. That's the point. The artist creates the work in a particular way to have a particular effect. They've just never been asked to articulate that before. So here they're guided through looking at form, structure, language, movement, design, performance, context, tonality, intensity, all these different wonderful words that we use a lot with music, but we don't tend to use for art in general. And then finally we check back across the narrative to see whether all this goes straight back to artistic purpose. If it does, you're on point. If it doesn't, you can ask yourself two questions. Is this because I have grown as an artist? Or have I crept away from my mission in some way? And that's for the artist to determine. That's not our job. So I ran the workshop this year 3 times with artists in Scotland, and I was really nervous about it because I expected a lot of pushback because they were being given a whole new job. They've been, audience development was taken away from them and audience benefit was given to them. And it was a hoop that they're not familiar with. But actually, thankfully, there was a lot of positive feedback that came back from it. The artists, that's a circular process. So the artists talked about how the workshop helped them to think about their audiences more deeply and opened their eyes to who the audiences for their work might be. It helped them think more deeply about the relationship between creative decisions and audience experience. And it helped them reassess how they describe their work and experiment with fresh, jargon-free language. And for some, it helped to focus them on the purpose of their work and created a lens that would help them in the creation of the work, even though that wasn't the intention of the model. So the workshops were so successful that Creative Scotland wanted to scale them, and it simply isn't cost effective to keep training me up to Scotland to run lots of workshops with lots of different people. That wasn't sustainable. So they commissioned me to translate this series of immersive exercises from the workshop into an online resource that artists could work through themselves, which is what I did. And it's in 2 parts. It's called the Performing Artists Audience Workshop, that workbook. The prelude, which isn't up there, is the reading document, which offers artists a lot of food for thought, as well as some frameworks to help them to grasp the complex phenomenon that is audience experience. The workbook, this, is the doing document. There's 6 chapters based around this process, and each one has 3 different exercises. And I'm just going to show, I've got a few pages out here for you to have a look at if you're interested afterwards. But basically, you simply print out the exercises that you want, you read it from left to right, you go from left brain to right brain, and you work through the guides and the tips before you're ready then to commit to the exercise. We wanted the workbook to be playful, naive, engaging, simple. We wanted it to appeal to artists, but actually even if I was writing this for non-artists, I would do it in this particular way, because you need to invite them to give their time to a process that isn't something that they're used to. But as devising artists, they are used to process. So I'm hoping that this will slot right into the way that they think already. So it launches in January 2020. And this is what I've been up to with rural touring in Scotland. Draw was a hands-on experiment to see how we could create more artistically vibrant new work. And the workbook is a place where we're trying to relocate audience experience into the heart of the touring system. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found it interesting and useful. If anybody's got any questions, I'm here. If anybody wants to have a little peek, this is just the first draft, it's not finished. The drawings aren't inked up, but do go and have a little look and I can talk through some of the pages with you. Thank you very much.